30 spokes meet in the hub, though the space between them is the essence of the wheel. Pots are formed from clay, though the space inside them is the essence of the pot. Walls with windows and doors form the house, though the space within them is the essence of the house. That's by 6th century Chinese poet and philosopher Lao Tzu, as you pronounce it. And it's a curious way of thinking about things. It's like, I don't know if you know the art of Rachel Whitehead. Her stuff is brilliant. She actually makes solid the invisible things inside a building, and therefore the building becomes invisible. So it's a sort of a reverse process. And King of Kumar is very much like that in the way he interrogates standard practices of architecture. So primarily we talked about the V&A Dundee building, which some of you may have been in or not, but also a bit more widely about his architecture and how the ideas around them. Although Kumar says that his building is hard on the outside, soft on the inside, I'm fascinated to find that close up, the angular sides of the building, especially its underbelly, are gently curved. Kumar has created this effect by varying the length, width, and spaces between the 2,500 rough precast concrete panels. And it is these spaces, gaps or apertures, that lie at the heart of his architectural philosophy. Indeed, he says that his design for Tokyo's Bato Hiroshogi Museum, completed in 2000, to house Japanese woodblock prints by the 18th century ukiyo artist Andrew Hiroshogi, marked a turning point in his career. And this is a quote: "I first discovered the effectiveness of public apertures in the Hiroshogi Museum. However, they are unlike architectural gaps that are complete in themselves. The public apertures I am thinking of are capable of connecting to the surrounding environment. Once I began to elaborate in other competitions what I had discovered in the Hiroshogi Museum, I became successful." So what are these spaces, gaps, or apertures? Kumar says that these descriptors are the nearest English word equivalents to describe the Japanese aesthetic concept of ma, that's M-A. We call this gap ma, he says, which means a space between particles, and in music it is the silence between the notes. In Japanese culture, ma is more important than the particles. I try to be sensitive to the size of the particles in the gap. I'm inspired by music and feel a strong empathy with musicians because I'm interested in the rhythm of the particles. I like the word rhythm. In music, rhythm is the most important thing, so if we find a good rhythm, naturally the music is comfortable. It is the same with architecture. Rhythm is the basis of my architectural designs. I try to compose something, to be a musician with the material. At its most literal translation, ma means negative space, or the space between two structural parts. But ma is much more than this. The Japanese and Chinese ideogram for ma is made up of the signs for moon and gate, showing how moonlight can stream through a gap in an entrance. It is the emptiness of these voids, or spaces that are full of promise, and therefore just as important, if not more so, than the more solid things that frame them. When we speak, a pause for breath can add significance to the surrounding words that are spoken. A silence in music can inform the notes played before and after it. And in Japanese calligraphy, shodo, and other aspects of design and architecture, ma offers a space for things to grow. That's like I'm saying about the language growing. The concept of emptiness and fullness, which dates back to Lao Tzu, the 6th century Chinese poet and philosopher, said to be the father of Taoism, is like yin and yang. One can't exist without the other, according to Francois Sheng in his book about the language of Chinese painting, Empty and Full. And in this book, I'll quote from the book, "Emptiness is not merely a neutral space serving to diffuse the shock without changing the nature of the opposition. It is the nodal point where potentiality and becoming interweave, in which deficiency and plenitude, self-sameness and otherness meet." And he adds that without gaps, or what he calls a median emptiness, yin and yang would be in a relationship of frozen opposition. A term Kumar might apply to the work of some of his competitors given that his attitude towards gaps is not shared by most Japanese architects. And he says, at international competitions, it is often pointed out that the overall silhouette of my scheme has many gaps, even though most Japanese architects abhor them. The larger organizational design offices in Japan, in particular, tend to fill in all gaps meticulously. Their schemes are indeed frozen. For Kumar, it is in these gaps between the materials, or what he calls particles, that he says the truth or essence of his buildings lie. For me, we try to avoid the solid, heavy wall as a canvas, as this rejects the relationship we try to create between the particles. The wooden panels are not straight. They are a little bit waving and shaking. It is not so easy to create this natural undulation, but the secret is the particles. The particles have a gap, which makes this building look more natural. It is the same with Impressionist painting. There's always a gap between the particles, and people feel that those Impressionist paintings look very natural. It's similar to the difference between analog sound and digital sound, where the brain fills in the gaps. Seeing these gaps, apertures, or gateways through the lens of nature and its connection to human beings is integral to Kumar's designs. When he wrote Death of Architectural Design, he referred to public buildings as repulsive and useless monuments. Instead, he blurs the line between the private and the public, tending to use the characteristics of the latter more as textures in his work. So in V&A Dundee, he has chosen louvered oak planks to line the interior space, rather than solid walls, to give it the warm intimacy of a private house, rather than a public museum. There are variations in the wood, not just in the gaps between each plank, but in the knots and grains of the wood, which in turn contrast with the rough texture of the exterior concrete. Kumar believes that the comfort and security of this living room, or womb-like space, resonates with our deepest, most primal feelings as human beings. He says, apertures, gaps, and roofs are devices that entice and connect. They invite people in and create shadows. The shadows are important as they make a building more humble. The straight wall without shadows is shiny and rejecting. I think shadow makes us calm. Maybe it's related to the history of humans. When we are living in the forest, we are living with the shadow of the forest. We have been living with shadows for a long, long time, so the gap between the particles is the most comfortable element of architecture. V&A Dundee is not a small building, but if you look at it from the Tay Bridge, it is marching into the townscape because of the option of shadows.